Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today we're gonna have a look at this little image of a nice house and a really cool garden. So let's get started. So overall, as you can see, it is an interesting image. I quite like if we talk about composition, I think the framing is interesting. It's worth noting that the image itself is more about the landscape in the garden rather than the actual house. So in terms of what would be the word, like ratio, it makes sense that most of the image is actually about the garden, and even the framing is about the garden, even though we have this interesting curve here that sort of leads your eye to this point. It works well because there's like what we call the greatest area of contrast, which is here. So like, for instance, if you look at it in black and white, you'll have all this sort of white area basically, which is going to be like where your eyes are going to go by default. So this is interesting because even though like we have like a nice, let me put this here, we have a nice garden, we can still have this sort of like small point of focus on the house. So this is nice. I'm not entirely sure about the cropping of the tree here. I don't mind like when you crop trees or crop anything, but it's just that it's sitting in a weird way in the image and we're cropping in a weird way on the tree. And also the shape is not exactly the most suiting for that kind of crop, I think. Because for instance, when you have something that really goes up like this, it doesn't matter because you understand that it's gonna go up. And when you have something that have this sort of mass and you cut it right before, I think it's not really that good. The thing is, I think having more of it would be almost even worse. So this is a bit tricky. I think you would almost want to have something to close the framing here. I don't know, it's a bit, I'm unsure about that. Also, I think the one thing that is a bit complicated as well with this tree is that you can see that they seem to be like interlocking in a weird way. So I'm not even sure if it's properly how they should be. If there was like just a single one, it would actually be okay. I think you would have like one nice trunk like that, and you had like maybe less leaves on top, or it's not even leaves, but whatever. So something like that. But in terms of framing, I think it's fine. I think I would have burned the sky a little bit more. Anyway, I'm trying to stay on track. Regarding the house directly, there's one thing that I think is like, you can see there's a bit of a discrepancy between the modeling of the garden and the modeling of the house. The thing is that the house is really simple, but it doesn't need much more work for it to look more realistic. I think a couple of things that would take it to the next level is like a proper texturing of the framings here. It looks extremely flat, which is kind of it's kind of a shame. So I would try to get like a better looking metal, or even if it's like PVC, then you have like more reflection. There's something to do with that. The other thing is that the house is a little bit burned, and this is something you don't really want to have. I would almost reverse the value here and have your sky almost burned and this like really light gray, so that you can actually read the texture of the plaster, or because I guess it's plaster or concrete or whatever, but you need to read like a little bit of a like noise basically. And another thing that I think is extremely important, and it actually becomes even more important in like exterior rendering, especially if you want to put like the accent on the surroundings where there's like vegetation, but it works as well if it's like urban area, but is to get like really nice reflection. By really nice reflection, I mean getting like this because here you can see there's this sort of like soft whitish thing that is not really like, I mean, it's not super interesting. And you can see that like for instance, the reflection here is like the albedo of the Vir sky normal one, which is not really fascinating either. And there's like this weird, I mean, something's weird with the glass. What I would suggest if, what I would suggest is to make sure to have a little bit of bump on them, because having like different types of bump will make sure that you don't have this, but that you have this, and like that it's gonna break the facade or like the reflection, which is nice. The other thing is that you need to get like a decent double glazing, so that when you get like a reflection, you're gonna actually get like double reflection with like a little bit of an offset, and it creates like a really different feeling when you look at it. And what else could you do for the glazing? I think there's also this issue that like you can see, for instance, that everything is blurry in the reflection, whereas what you want is to get like really sharp reflection. Like basically you have the sharp reflection but reflected twice, which means that you have like a little bit of, it's not blur, it's just like well, it's kind of a blur, let's say. But the thing is that you still have like sharp reflection of the surrounding vegetation, and this is going to be like extremely interesting. So this is why, like for instance, here you would expect like to have something reflected a little bit more interesting than this, so that then you would have like all this feeling a little bit more like green rather than white. And this would be quite nice to sort of relate more to the surrounding. As in the previous image that I did, I would say I would always go with some sort of a depth of field, even if it's just a little, but to always get like a little bit of out of focus for the foreground, because it always helps in leading the eye, and it always helps in adding a little bit of realism, I think. Even though we're not like seeing blurry all the time, but our peripheral vision as humans is usually a little bit blurry. So that would be it. In terms of colors, I think it's really nice. I like the idea that everything is a little bit overexposed, but it gives a nice feel to it. For instance, this, I don't know if it's just a texture or if it's actually out of focus, but it looks really cool. So that's that. I like having the shadow here works really well, and that kind of like diagonal that you have here is like really working properly. I think the issue is that, yeah, basically the composition leads you to this element, and the thing is that the rest is better modeled and detailed than this actual element. So I would add what I said earlier, and maybe a tiny bit of details, just so that you don't get too much of a discrepancy in terms of modeling between the two. And then you would get like a properly unified image that would look really, really, really nice. In terms of details, they're like this kind of small fuck ups where stuff are like hitting through the trees and like geometry not properly working. But beside that, also there's this thing that I think relates to the path of another image that I'm gonna have a look after, but that is not properly read, I think. But it's a matter of like actual landscaping design. I don't know like if the transition is supposed to be like that, or if we're supposed to have like a little bit of dirt or soil visible before we actually switch to the high grass and whatever that's called, flowers and shit. So yeah, this, I think the issue again, for instance, is that the fact that this is white, usually you would want this to be since it's in the background, contrast should be lower and it should be slightly lighter. The thing is that when this is already the lightest point in the image, you can't make this recess by using conventional aerial perspective. So this is why then this thing becomes a little bit harder to read. So you have two options here, I think. You can get rid of it. You can try to make your little tree go in front of there so that you really cut it. Or you can do what I said earlier by like completely changing your, hierarchy of values by having this being the brightest, this being slightly less bright, and this being again slightly less bright. As like in terms of perception, you would still read this as white because your sky would be burnt basically. So you would understand that even though it's like slightly light gray, it's still supposed to be white. If you really want to, and that's the thing is like, usually blue and green doesn't work really well together without proper neutral colors. Here it's fine because you've desaturated quite a lot, so it works nicely, but still I would advise that kind of refining of the hierarchy. I think that's all I have to say. In terms of modeling, the rest is completely fine. Didn't notice that, but yeah, cool. Yeah, no, really, really nice image. There's like, I think the composition is really interesting and gives like a nice dynamic to the garden with the house relationship. So yeah, good job. Hopefully the tips I had will help and that you'll find some ways to use them in another image. And maybe, yeah, again, sorry for coming back to this. I think one of the other issue is also the way it hides the actual shape of the house to the point that you're not entirely sure of like what you're getting. I will for sure not tell you, make the tree transparent please, because this doesn't make sense, but there's always ways to place stuff so that you can read the geometry properly. Usually you want to avoid putting stuff on corners properly, or at least on all corners so that you can't read them. So here it's fine, but here for instance we can't read this one, we can't read this one, can't read this one. So maybe it's a bit too much. So yeah, maybe there's something to do with this tree, but the rest of the image, good job. So yeah, thanks guys, and I'll see you in the next teardown. Cheers.